Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk Books at NMU. I am Lynn Domina, professor and head of the English department here at Northern Michigan University. And today I'm welcoming Gail Okawa, author of the recently published Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II. We will be continuing this webinar series monthly on the third Friday of each month at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Our presenter next month will be Melissa Homestead, and she'll be talking about her book, The Only Wonderful Things, The Creative Partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen the icons for the chat and for Q&A. Feel free to use the chat to talk with one another. If you'd like to post a question for our speaker, use the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that for our question period, which will follow her presentation. If you see a question that someone else has asked and that question interests you, you can give it a thumbs up icon, and that will let me know it's a popular question. This episode is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube, likely by the middle of next week. If you'd like a link to the recording when it is available, just email me at english@nmu.edu and I'll forward the link. Before we get started, I want to share a big thanks to Matt Herbig from Audio and Visual Services here at NMU, who is helping with the technical end of this series. It's always good when you're someone who's not real technical to have an expert who's so patient and kind. And also thanks to Dr. Rob Wynn, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, who is supporting us financially. Now, I'd like to introduce Gail. Dr. Okawa, a granddaughter of a Japanese Christian minister interred in several U.S. Justice and War Department prison camps during World War II, is a professor emerita of English at Youngstown State University in Ohio, and a visiting scholar at the Center for Biographical Research at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Interested in the relationships among language, literacy, culture, and race in historical, political, and educational contexts, she has published numerous articles in national journals and collections and has presented papers and lectures nationally and internationally. In 2002, as a scholar in residence at the Smithsonian Institute, she began researching the politics of literacy, identity, and culture among Japanese immigrants from Hawaii, including her maternal grandfather, who was imprisoned during World War II in U.S. Justice and War Department internment camps like those at Lordsburg and Santa Fe, New Mexico. So, Dr. Okawa, welcome. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Domina. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Domina and NMU for inviting me to share my book and research with you in this new webinar series. I also understand that some in the audience may be reading the graphic novel, We Hereby Refuse, about events precipitated by President Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066, 80 years ago tomorrow. For those who may not know, this order led to the mass removal and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese immigrants and their American children from the West Coast and to inland concentration camps. The date is marked by Japanese American communities across the country as a day of remembrance. So let me see if I can manage the technology here. On this day before EO 9066 sealed the fate of Americans of Japanese ancestry 80 years ago, we must also remember that December 7th was a day of many infamies, with Pearl Harbor being attacked by the Empire of Japan, resulting in thousands of deaths and allowing the US to enter World War II, and the immediate arrests of hundreds of Japanese immigrant men called Issei, like Jim Akutsu's father in the graphic novel. Fathers and grandfathers suddenly arrested by the FBI, military, or local police over 2 months before EO 9066. I had no knowledge of how these arrests had impacted my family until I was in high school. I first learned from a neighbor that my maternal grandfather, Reverend Tamasaku Watanabe, had been imprisoned on the mainland during World War II. My family had never talked about it. I was shocked and ran home to question my parents. They only confirmed the fact and said, quote, "He came back a changed man," unquote. It seemed to be a closed subject then. Decades later, in the 1990s, my mother shared some letters that her father had written to her from New Mexico. And you may be able to see the return address at the bottom of the letter as well as at the top. And I found this lone photo in a trunk. And she identified her father in the third row on the right-hand side. But it wasn't until 2001 that I applied for a sabbatical leave to focus on why he was in New Mexico and how he got there. I was just beginning a long journey to answer those questions when the 9/11 attacks occurred and cast World War II internment events into particularly sharp focus, with immediate relevance to how the US treats its immigrants and ethnic citizens. Like many Americans born during the war, I was ignorant of the actual circumstances surrounding the conflict with Japan and naively believed narratives about Pearl Harbor being the initial trigger event in the Pacific War. In my book, I share some of my discoveries dispelling that belief and how historical events were intertwined with the lives of individual fathers and grandfathers, including my own. Today, I'll touch on the differing circumstances of the Issei, the immigrants from Hawaii, and others imprisoned by the Justice and War Departments as early as December 7th, 1941. I'll use the example of my grandfather. Like all immigrants, Tamasaku Watanabe, and you can see him here in the middle of the photo when he was young. Tamasaku Watanabe had a pre-war life. He had chosen to leave the village his village in Hiroshima for San Francisco in 1905 at age 22, was baptized as a Christian there, and served as the secretary of the Japanese YMCA, precursor to the Japanese Presbyterian Church. Witnessing the devastation of the great San Francisco earthquake, he had been inspired to enter the San Francisco Theological Seminary to formally join the Christian ministry. He married. Started a family in California, and served at two Japanese Christian churches in California, one in Stockton and one in Sacramento. But in the early 1920s, he answered the call to serve as an evangelist in the Hawaiian Islands. In October 1922, when the family was preparing to leave for Hawaii, their youngest child, a 2-year-old, was killed in an accident with an oil truck. Although grieving for this loss, Reverend Watanabe packed up his family, grandma and 3 children, and they made the difficult trip across the ocean a few weeks later. He was assigned to the island of Maui, where he served Japanese Christian church members. There he is on the very top row, for 12 years. Then was transferred to serve plantation workers on the island of Hawaii. However, men like Reverend Watanabe also became government targets as leaders in their communities. Leadership largely based on their literacy. I believe some of the most complex acts of covert violence surrounding World War II concerned the surveillance of resident Japanese immigrants pre-December 7th, and their arrest and incarceration immediately upon the attack. So we might look at some backstory reflecting pre-war assumptions and activities. These are things that I discovered in my research to dispel my naive beliefs. First, we can look at anti-Japanese immigration laws. The exclusion of the Japanese from US citizenship reflected the overt racism in US policy. Although most Issei were longtime residents of the US, my grandfather having lived in the US for 36 years at the time Pearl Harbor occurred, exclusionary naturalization laws, which dated to the 1719 Naturalization Act and tested by the Supreme Court case Ozawa versus US in 1924, had barred the Japanese from citizenship, making them permanently aliens. In time of war, citizens of countries with whom the US goes to war are considered alien enemies by virtue of their country of origin. So this is an immigration status to keep in mind. Then there was the Patton Plan. In 1935, George S. Patton Jr. was then a lieutenant colonel and began serving as chief of US Army intelligence in Hawaii at that time. And then sometime between 1935 and 1937, while he was there, he prepared a secret plan, the initial seizure of Orange nationals. This called for the seizure of prominent Japanese Americans and resident Japanese aliens in Hawaii as hostages in the event of war with Japan. He applied the term orange to not only the Japanese in Japan, which was what the War Department was doing at that time, but he applied it also to the residents, US residents of Japanese background. He listed a total of 128 hostages, reflecting the belief that, as one scholar put it, quote, ethnicity was the most important factor in assessing Japanese loyalty or disloyalty, unquote. Other forms of loyalty to the US, even previous military service, didn't count. So this was guilt by reason of race. We can see the government surveillance in my grandfather's Department of Justice case file. I don't know if you can see it, if you can, at the very top of the screen, Department of Justice, Division of Records. And the what was contained in the file was this confidential informant, or these confidential informant note cards. Dated April 1942, he's identified as a consular agent, which meant that he was appointed by the consul, the Japanese consulate, to assist the less literate folks. Many plantation people were not literate or had difficulty with certain tasks. And so you can see from this description, if you can read any of it, that his duty as a consular agent is primarily to aid eligible Japanese in filing their annual applications or petitions for exemption from Japanese military service, to handle expatriation matters, and so on and so forth. But basically, it acknowledges the public service position of the consular agent in this description. So it was based on leadership, on literacy. There was nothing secretive about these men. In fact, their names were published in public directories because they were performing a public service. Now, according to the note, which is right down here, if you can see this, at the bottom of the first note card, the agents are chosen from the leading alien Japanese of the communities. And then there is the supposition in the second part of that sentence, down here. They are believed to act as espionage agents or observers. Now, this is repeated in various reports, and though only a supposition, or worse, a fabrication, through repetition, it gets codified. By May 1941, J. Edgar Hoover wrote this memo on my grandfather, recommending custodial detention based on those words. So it is, in the second paragraph, it is recommended that this individual be considered for custodial detention in the event of a national emergency. The information contained on the attached dossier constitutes the basis for appropriate consideration in this regard. And as I said, I looked for something terrible that he may have done, and there wasn't anything. By July 18th, 1941, so a half year before Pearl Harbor was attacked, the US Department of Justice and War Department had a collaborative agreement to set up 24 prison camps, targeting mainly Issei, primarily men, and primarily community leaders from the territory of Hawaii and the mainland. Then there was the ABC list. Although Patton's report was apparently discarded as an operational plan in 1940, some form of it appeared in the plan that became operational in 1941. By November 21st, 1941, so just a couple of weeks before the attack, this document titled Memorandum Seizure and Detention Plan, Japanese, stamped secret on each page, had been drawn up by Lieutenant Colonel George Bicknell, including extensive lists of Japanese aliens. And of course, they were immigrants. These immigrants were barred from US citizenship, and US-born Japanese in Hawaii who would be apprehended in case of war. So this, as I said, became known as the ABC list and included consular agents like Reverend Watanabe, newspaper editors and journalists, clergy, Christian, Shinto, and Buddhist alike, language school teachers, merchants, and other civilians. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Reverend Watanabe was arrested on that Sunday in his parsonage at the Ola Japanese Christian Church. The warrant was dated December 7th, 1941. So with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, even before war was officially declared on December 8th, technically even before alien enemies became, before aliens became alien enemies, hundreds of those on the ABC list were rounded up within hours and imprisoned. My grandfather was arrested, as I said, in his parsonage, and the language in this warrant, that you can see right here, the language on suspicion of being an alien enemy sounds sinister, but as you know by now, merely refers to his immigration status. And again, at the very bottom of this slide, you can see the Alien Enemies Act of 1918, based on the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798, changed the label of aliens to alien enemies with the declaration of war. So this happened, technically it happened to Germans and Italians as well. The civilian hearing of my grandfather reflects manipulation, bullying. I discussed this at some length in the book and don't have time to go into it here. But there were constant questions, well, who do you want to win, your country or our country? And he basically refused to answer. To his credit, he would not be manipulated, is one way of interpreting that. But the judgment of the hearing board seemed to be in his favor. As you notice, the board, having carefully considered the evidence before it, and this was a very long hearing, an 11-page hearing, as opposed to what was much more common, 5, 6, 7 pages. But the hearing board finds, 1, that the internee is a subject of Japan, 2, that the internee owes allegiance to Japan. After all, they could not have allegiance to any other country because they could not be citizens of the US or any other country at that point. And 3, that the internee's activities have been pro-Japanese, though not necessarily anti-American. And the vote was 3-1 in favor of his release. But they sent him instead to Honolulu, to the immigration station, and to the Sand Island internment camp. His mugshot was especially distressing for me, representing the indignity, undoubtedly the humiliation for him, like hundreds of others. And these are just a couple of Signal Corps photos of the Sand Island internment camp, which was a tent camp behind barbed wire. Behind rows, you can see 2 rows of barbed wire. Then the judgment of the Military Intelligence Board overturned the civilian decision with the language, and you can see this at the very bottom of the screen, it appearing necessary. And those of us in English appreciate the passive voice, the use of the passive voice. It appearing necessary, it is ordered that Tamasaku Watanabe be interned. Now, these men also had lives, families and occupations, and I thought I'd share this with you just to give you a few more faces in terms of this whole internment experience, the violation of the internment. Nearly 700 men were eventually shipped out from Hawaii in 10 boatloads crossing the Pacific. And these men were, I finally identified, were actually with my grandfather on the same boatload. This was Reverend Fujitani, who was a Buddhist priest, Reverend Ikuma, who was a Shinto priest, Mr. Kinoshita, who was a plantation worker and was known to participate in his children's PTA meetings. Mr. Kato was a coffee farmer. Mr. Kawasaki, who was an attorney, comes and he figures in later in this story. Mr. Shigenaga, who was a business owner, and Mr. Ohama, Mr. Mizutari were both Japanese language school principals. And my grandfather here in the right-hand corner. They were then sent to various camps run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service or the US Army. And I call this my grandfather's incarceration log because he has a listing of the different places where he was sent. The Kilauea military camp on the Big Island, then to Honolulu, then from the immigration station to Sand Island, then shipped across to California, Angel Island, Fort Sam Houston, Lordsburg internment camp in Santa Fe. And you can see a little bit better on this map how they were shipped, of course, from the Pacific to California, then to Texas for 10 days, and then up to Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico and to Santa Fe. As I said, there were 10 boatloads, and others were sent on different routes, so that I was able to conclude that there were several others. And you can see in the bottom screen, at the bottom of the screen, the full routes, and these may not actually be, I've been hearing about other people's stories, and there may have been other routes as well, but these are the ones that I was able to find for the people from Hawaii at the time that I was putting all this together. So you have the first transfer boat going from Hawaii to Angel Island, to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, Camp Forest, Tennessee, to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. And some of those internees were then sent to Fort Missoula, Montana, before they were sent to Santa Fe. Others were sent directly from Camp Livingston to Santa Fe. People on the second boat were sent from Angel Island all the way to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which has become known in the last few years for childhood arrests and internment. And then down to Camp Livingston, some again to Fort Missoula, to Santa Fe, others directly from Livingston to Santa Fe. And you can get an idea from these photos of the kind of environment that these men had to encounter. This was Fort Sam Houston, the internees were up here in the first 6 rows. We had no photos of Lordsburg, Camp Lordsburg, but George Hoshida had documented in drawings the different views of the camp at Lordsburg. And this is from a painting by Reverend Kazumi Matsumoto of the Santa Fe camp. Otokichi Ozaki, a journalist, describes the physical conditions at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which took a psychological toll on the internees, and I think describes a pretty general kind of experience on the part of these internees. And I'd like to read some of his observations. Here at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where glittering heat waves rise and peak as far as the eye could see, the jumbled sound of machines and hammers can be heard, triggered apparently by the sudden need for more barracks. There's not a tree to be seen. Tents stand in rows. The heat, as though the wind is dead. No soap rations, no toothpaste. What money we had was taken from us, so we have none. We become irritable. Eat, sleep, wake up. Eat, sleep, wake up. A life cut off from everything in the world. The unbearable monotony of a life without variation seems to slowly warp our minds. The crazy weather and the tent life, one cannot help but begin to lose one's mind. Are we not becoming like leaking balloons, ambitionless, lethargic, and apathetic? How did these men, with an average age of 55, my grandfather was 59 when he was picked up, how did these men survive this injustice? Ironically, they used the same character and characteristics of leadership, literacy, and cultural literacy that made them targets. As newspaper editors, Buddhist, Shinto, and Christian clergy, teachers, attorneys, and businessmen, after all, the DOJ took the leaders of Hawaii's Japanese communities. Many of the Issei were educated and highly literate and understood the significance of the written and spoken word in English and Japanese. I found that while these men felt the oppressiveness and loss of control of wrongful incarceration, their greatest forms of resistance to that oppression may be found in their efforts to maintain personal equilibrium and balance. Efforts supported by the Japanese value of gaman, which is stoicism or internal control, as well as realistically recognizing reality in attempting to cope with it. Much of the material that I've collected reflects the Issei's strong reliance on literacy and cultural literacy in maintaining their equilibrium. Profound efforts to maintain connections with communities outside the camp, predictably with home, and to create different communities within camp society. Naojiro Hirano, whom I introduced in my book, referred to the mind-numbing monotony described by Ozaki as barbed wire disease. And he writes, "It has been said that an internee is most likely to succumb to the discomfort, It has been said that an internee is most likely to succumb to the discouragement and depression known as barbed wire disease. To keep myself out of the disease, I am participating in many activities at this camp. The following examples, here is his note from his notebook, where he talks about barbed wire disease. The following examples of personal and public expression serve not only as forms of expression, but as forms of resistance, both overt and covert. These provide insights into some of the most intimate and human aspects of the Justice Department's mass incarceration. So to understand those many activities, I borrowed a template of a psychologist named John Laffin, who describes how long-term captives often use universal human strategies to cope with the deprivation of freedom and the malaise of boredom. Strategies that the internees adapted to their culture and practices as Hawai'i Japanese. So kind of dovetailing of universal and cultural strategies. I'll just give you a few examples. Of the physically creative strategy, there was painting, sketching. This is a painting by Reverend Shingetsu Akahoshi, whom I was privileged to interview. He was the first internee survivor that I was able to interview, and he was an artist, both in Western style, as you can see here, and in the previous slide here, he also painted this Japanese style painting. And sketching. As I mentioned, George Hoshida kept an incredible visual record of the entire internment, his entire internment experience. And one of the great treasures, which is housed in the Japanese American National Museum, is a very large set of portrait sketches that he made of different internees. And this is the one he did of my grandfather to the left. Mr. Matsumoto was one of the internee survivors whom I was able to spend some time with. He was 100 years old at the time that I met him. And he introduced me to an incredible craft that he had learned when he was a child in Hiroshima. This was actually, these are longleaf pine needles, which he gathered in Camp Livingston, braided, flattened, I don't know how, but flattened and braided into strips. And these strips then were actually sewn together into these purses. These are in my possession. He entrusted me with them, and I'm hoping to donate them to the proper museum, because this is absolutely incredible craft work. Another strategy was, of course, the physically active one, including sports. Again, these men were from ages 25 or so all the way up into probably into their 70s to make that 55 age average. And so they participated in sports such as sumo and baseball being very popular, of course, hiking. And again, Mr. Matsumoto was very active in that period of his life. He participated in theater performances. The internees built a stage, and I gather that they must have used their time very wisely, because they made these costumes. And Mr. Matsumoto played the part of a woman, which was very common in Japanese theater for men to play the women's roles. So he participated as an actor of women's roles. one of the stories I had heard was that those people who played women's roles were kind of relieved of duties, certain kinds of duties that would that would toughen up their hands. He did not remember that when I asked him. Here he is in plain clothes. The intellectual strategy, of course, was probably the most developed. And I actually broke this down into personal forms and public forms. You can imagine that the personal letter writing was extremely important, but there were some who also kept memoirs. So this was the standard government stationery. And of course, they were also censored. I have many examples of censored letters. They may have been censored in part, or sometimes whole paragraphs were cut out. Reverend Odate's journal. Mr. Kato, who was the coffee farmer I introduced you to earlier, kept a very detailed record of his experience. And this was the first page of what became a memoir, translated by his daughter and wife. And one of the important documents that I was able to use to construct a kind of a narrative, an overarching narrative. Now, there were also those who kept records. Mr. Hoshida kept visual records. Mr. Kawasaki, the attorney, kept written records. Partly because of his background as an attorney, I'm sure he was very efficient at this. But he was also the elected the spokesman for the camp at one point, and he kept a scrapbook with typed records. Again, very important in terms of how I was able to understand what happened to my grandfather, because I had no records from him, but both Mr. Kato and Mr. Kawasaki were on the same transfer boat and went to the same camps. So I was able to get a sense of what happened to my grandfather as well as these men. As you can see, he actually summarized his internment after he returned home, but all of that information was provided. Mr. Kawasaki also told a very interesting story about the Geneva Convention. And I wanted to mention this because the Geneva Convention applied to these men. And this was one of the most interesting documents that I was able to find in the National Archives. You can imagine, first of all, that at Missoula, many of the Japanese who were arrested from the mainland on December 7th and shortly after that were sent to Fort Missoula. They were highly abused. There were many what I would consider atrocities committed in the camp at that time. So much so that by April 28th, the one of the special officials, Lemuel Schofield, had to write this memo. And I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my equipment here, but I'd like to read what it says here about humane treatment. Detainees must at all times be humanely treated and protected, particularly against acts of violence, insults, and public curiosity. Physical coercion must not be resorted to, and except in self-defense to prevent escape or for purposes of proper search, no employee of this service under any pretext shall invade the person of any detainee. No measures calculated to humiliate or degrade shall be undertaken. Those, of course, were violated, which required this memo to be written. He concludes with the statement that, quote, the spirit of the Geneva Convention, as well as the letter of these instructions, must be carefully followed at all times. The first duty of the service, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, in connection with the detention of enemy aliens entrusted to its custody, is their safekeeping. Next, but fully as important, is the obligation to treat them fairly and humanely in accordance with the principles of treatment to which the United States government is committed. Thought this was very interesting, and certainly in light of current events, this is interesting. But the internees could not appreciate or use that information until it was translated. And interestingly enough, Reverend Yoshiaki Fukuda, a Konkokyo minister from California, took it upon himself, and he, together with some of his compatriots, translated that document and actually went from barrack to barrack, he says in his memoir, to explain their rights based on the Geneva Convention. The internees also sought to keep themselves abreast of what was going on in the world. And so there would be those people who had bilingual skills would listen to the news reports in English and translate them into Japanese, and they would have these news broadcasts gatherings, which were very, as you can see from this sketch, very well attended. They also had a publishing office and a really quite elaborate printing shop. In addition, they wrote petitions to the military governor of the territory of Hawaii, the Provost Marshal General, Edward Ennis, who was the director of the Alien Enemy Control Unit, and others. And I'd like to note that in using the petition, internees were employing a document and discourse categorically outlawed to them. The US Supreme Court in US versus Cruikshank in 1876 had declared that the right of the people to petition is, quote, an attribute of citizenship, unquote. However, as I mentioned, Ozawa versus US had excluded the Japanese from US citizenship. So you might say that it was outlawed to them. Yet even in his somewhat halting English, my grandfather maintained the right to use the language and the discourse of the form, arguing, actually making a case for his parole. And as I wrote in my book, it was really for the sake of his children. He was doing his job in the camps, perhaps doing his job better than he could have anywhere else, because he was ministering to those who really needed him. But he felt the need to appeal to the government for a rehearing so that he would be able to clear his name. And this was for the sake of his children. Here you can see that he actually has a section labeled loyalty. Now, this petition, signed by a group of about 200 Hawaii men, it was dated February 1944, and addressed to the military governor and the other officials. And this requested, quote, immediate transfer of all of us from Santa Fe detention camp to some similar internment camp or camps located and maintained under your command in Hawaii. And this was based on their good citizenship. So the irony of them being excluded for their citizenship, considered disloyal because they weren't citizens. I think you can see that irony, describing themselves as, quote, permanently domiciled aliens in the enforced status of ineligibility to citizenship. They argued that they were, in fact, good citizens based on gainful employment, public service, loyalty, and so on. And I find each signature, primarily in English, represents the assertion of each man presented collectively for us. My grandfather's signature is down here at the bottom of that page. In each case, the petitioners are assuming and asserting membership in a democratic system despite its rejection of them. Another strategy I called the spiritual and ritual strategy due to the many photos I found of smaller and larger gatherings. I added this to Laffin's list of strategies because I found these to be very significant to the Japanese prisoners. You see men of different faiths at these services, smaller services like this one. This is clearly a Buddhist service because of the ministers in their robes in the back of the room. But my grandfather is sitting here in the front as a Christian. So these were Japanese men attending services for people whom they considered important in their lives. This is another Buddhist service here, and my grandfather's in the back. And there were massive services. This was a Tenrikyo memorial service, probably for one of the ministers in the camp, Reverend Odachi, whose family I was able to interview. And this also gives us a good idea of the surrounding area. One of the very few photos that allows us to understand that. This is a Christian funeral, and again, in the same location. So you can understand the theater, how the theater was built in this open area. And this is an iconic photo of a military son, soldier son, who was brought back to Santa Fe to attend the funeral of his father. Again, a Buddhist funeral. You can see all of the Buddhist ministers gathered here. A very unusual gathering of these large groups of men from different faiths. Then the final group of strategies we can look at in terms of the imaginative. Some internees enjoyed calligraphy, as you can see here to the right. Some wrote plays. My grandfather actually had this play in his belongings called An Evening in Bethlehem for Christmas. But poetry writing was a favorite pastime for some of the internees, even before the war. Reverend Mr. Soga was a journalist, and others wrote tanka, the 5-line Japanese poem. And Reverend Odate, who was a Buddhist minister, wrote haiku. In fact, his daughter told me that he thought in haiku, and that his wife would sit with a little notebook and as he would compose his haiku, she would write this down. So this was obviously pre-war and post-war. These men published their work and others, the work of others, in collections such as this one, Kodama. Such publications were a testimony to their long-term purpose, one that transcended the boundaries of the Santa Fe internment camp's barbed wire. Soga clearly states the purpose of this collection to be both cultural and political, and for posterity. And I'll read you what he wrote in his preface. After the onset of World War II, from Alaska in the north to Hawaii in the south, Japanese men from all stations and walks of life were incarcerated in this camp in Santa Fe. Although we are from different backgrounds and situations, we are alike in that we have been forced to abandon our homes, leave our families, and experience the trauma and indignity of living in a prison camp. The Literary Society of Santa Fe Bungei Kyokai, was born in this harsh environment and circumstances. We have bonded in a unique way to express ourselves in poetry. The publication of this anthology, Kodama, is a demonstration to the world and future generations to come of the true Japanese spirit of Yamato Damashi, the strong Japanese character of calm in the face of unbearably harsh adversity. It is our hope that this effort will help to establish a peaceful world for future generations. So these were educated and highly literate men who made every effort to maintain their cultural identities and forms principally and deliberately through language. Please allow me to close with a few lines from chapter 9 in my book. If the authorities' intent was to destabilize the Hawaii Japanese communities by removing their leaders, they had to have succeeded, at least in part, depriving the communities of their religious, intellectual, and economic base. If the government's purpose was to break the Issei spirit, however, it failed. By their extensive organizing, indulging in activities of the mind and spirit, as well as their physical well-being, the Issei prisoners resisted that compliance and subjugation. What was an appearance of cooperation which so pleased the camp officials, in fact, was an assertion of their will to manage their lives and maintain their integrity and dignity. So their desired legacy was calm in the face of unbearably harsh adversity. A peaceful world. Mr. Soga also leaves us with this question. When the war is over, and after we are gone, who will visit this lonely grave in the wild where my friend lies buried? Who will remember him, them, their imprisoned presence, and how? So our inheritance as American Japanese and as Americans of all backgrounds is to remember not only this historical violation of human rights during World War II and the individual and collective human spirit that survived it, but also our responsibility to protect our society from going down such paths in the future as we hear talk of divisiveness and civil war. Such violations do not occur in a vacuum, as I hope my discoveries in my, as I hope my discoveries in my book and this talk have illustrated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. This has been really interesting and very moving. I know that you wanted me to share a flyer about an upcoming event that I will do before we move into any questions, which I'm not finding. Let's see here. Here we are. So would you like to talk about this event coming up?
Yes. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. On April 23rd, we're going to have an anniversary celebration or commemoration of the establishment of the Santa Fe internment camp marker, historical marker. The question I asked at the end of my talk regarding our remembrance, our memories, and our responsibilities is somewhat tied in with this event. In that, in 2002, a group of community members and relatives of internees, actually it started before then, in the late 1990s, proposed the establishment of a marker, a historical marker, to at least acknowledge the fact that Santa Fe had one of the largest, if not the largest, internment camp for enemy, for what was called alien enemies. But basically what we've been talking about today, the immigrant Japanese. This was highly controversial at the time. And it actually split the community, the Santa Fe community. So that in the city council, there was a tie. And the mayor ended up voting for the establishment of the marker. So this was an incredibly divisive time, at the same time that it was it was the beginning of great healing. And I was beginning my research project at that time, was invited to attend the dedication ceremony in 2002 because I was a family member or a descendant of an internee. And it was one of the most moving experiences I could have had. It really brought home to me that this was not simply a sabbatical research project, but rather this was a project concerned not only with my own family, but with the community history, the collective history of my community. So 10 years later, I organized, not single-handedly by any means, but I proposed that we have a 10th anniversary ceremony, celebration, commemoration. And here we are in the 20th year now. And this is an attempt to also in some way commemorate the original internees who were brought to Santa Fe unwillingly. But those of us who recognize their sacrifice, we would like to also recognize the sacrifice and the courage of the Santa Feans who made the choice to establish this marker. So this event is a day-long event. And I do want to mention that it is going to be in person. We've been fighting for it to be in person, and we're hoping we will win against COVID. But we are also planning to live stream it to the extent that we can, and to record it so that it can be viewed later. So I wanted to let people know that this is happening. In case you are interested, you can contact me at the email address at the bottom of the flyer, Gail Okawa, sfic@gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you. So if anyone who's watching has a question, you can certainly put that in the Q&A. I certainly noticed as you were talking that this project involved some extraordinary research. I'm thinking both clearly archival research, but also some on-site research at various places. Could you talk a little bit about what it took to even the preliminary steps before you could even start writing this book?
Oh, well, as I think I've told you, this was an 18-year project. It started in 2001 when I first proposed the sabbatical project to the faculty. And once I was granted the sabbatical, of course, I had to start from scratch. And I had not worked in the archives before, the National Archives before, but I did have some wonderful guidance. I was, as I think it was mentioned, I was a scholar in residence at the Smithsonian, so I had access to many of the facilities in Washington, D.C. And the most important thing, of course, were the contacts, people I was introduced to who could advise me on the use of the archives. And it took months and months, of course, and I was lucky enough to have months and months, but
Yeah.
because I was a resident, but it took months and months for me to go to the downtown archives, which is where the Immigration Naturalization Service records are kept, or they were at that time. And then I also, since I lived in Silver Spring, I was renting an apartment, a room rather. I could drive to the College Park archives, the National Archives at College Park, which is where the many of the central records of World War II were kept. And so I spent hours and hours closing down the the research room on many, many occasions, and collected thousands of pages of documents. So that was a really amazing process, because I was scanning and photocopying these many, many pages of documents from 5 different files. I found 5 different files on my grandfather, but this also made me aware of these hundreds of other men from Hawaii who were in the same boat, literally and figuratively, and so I started it occurred to me as I was doing the research, after I found the 5 files, and because I found all those other files, I started to sort of pivot a bit in my view of what I was really going to pursue. And the other thing is that because my grandfather, I could not find any, he was a meticulous record keeper. We had his little notepad, pocket-sized appointment books from years before and years after. But for some reason, there was nothing in that period. And so up till December 7th, in 1941, it was up till December 7th. And then after that, we didn't have records. So this is why it became so important for me when I started discovering the records of other family members, I realized that I really could understand more about what happened to him through these other records. And I was very fortunate to find that one scrapbook that I mentioned that I showed you of Mr. Kawasaki's records, because he was an attorney and he kept copious notes. And then Mr. Kato's journal and his letters also. His family members, his daughter and his wife had translated all of this and for the family, but this now has become an important document for us to understand a more general experience on the part of internees. So I integrated much of what he talked about and his experience together with other documents that I found in the archives and Mr. Kawasaki's official documents as well. I tried to integrate all of that to create a narrative arc.
Yeah.
For the story.
Yeah. And yes, it definitely, the book does certainly have a narrative. We have a question here from an attendee that says, I was wondering about your parents' experience during this event. Did they also share what they knew, or what experiences did they share with you? And what kinds of writings did they keep, if any?
Well, as I described, when I was a high school student and first learned about this, went home to question my parents, they didn't say much, except that he came back a changed man. And, kids in those days, back in the 40s, or in the 40s, and this was now in the 50s, we knew how much we could ask and when to shut up. And it was one of those situations where, as I recall anyway, there wasn't much room to inquire.
Mm-hmm.
And, it just, the time passed. And when my mother finally started to bring these letters out, I realized that she was very engaged in this whole process. But this was, the Japanese American families who encountered this particular kind of humiliation. They weren't talking about it openly at that time. It was just, and it was because it was so surreptitious. The FBI came, took these men, and they disappeared, basically. In some cases, family members didn't know what happened to them until days or weeks later. They couldn't go and see them, depending on which island they were on. There were different points of access. So I don't know, I don't have any details about what happened to my grandfather in terms of the actual arrest. All I know is that he was arrested in his parsonage. I don't know how my grandmother reacted. I can only imagine how much of a shock it was, partly because they were Christians. They were very much in what I would consider the assimilated a group of Japanese. And, they had bought into, if I may use that term, they had bought into the whole American dream and, American values and so on. So I'm sure it was very shocking to them.
Yeah.
And so, when you start to think of it on that particular level, one can only imagine, because we don't know the exact details, but from other people's stories, I could tell how much trauma was involved in those arrests. Right. Now, and some of those stories had to come later. In other words, there were those who were picked up right on the first day, and then there were those who were picked up later. So, the different boatloads of men some of it, the timing of the boatloads were reflective of when they were picked up. So the men who went out in the first, second, and third boatloads generally had been picked up very early on. So I'm not sure if I'm following the question at this point, but it was very hard. This was not something that was commonly discussed in the family.
Yeah.
I'm sure this was true of many families. People just wanted to move on and, and continue with their lives. But it actually is in my generation, my mother's generation tried to move on. But I think in our generation, the third generation, there is more interest in sort of peeling back the onion, and trying to understand what happened. And some of that, of course, in many cases, we have no access to that information. We didn't ask the questions when we could have and should have. It's that kind of, could have, should have kind of thing, because I didn't even ask my mother as many questions as I wish I had. But she was very, very supportive of this project. And she was there to look at all of the photos that I brought home, and she could identify her father. She read everything that I brought home to, these different memoirs and autobiographical treatments and so on. So she was very much involved in the process in her later life. But I've heard many stories of people who, like me, who started to learn about this fairly late. I'm still hearing from people who are asking questions. Since we sent the flyer out, I've received a few queries about people who are doing work on their grandfathers, great-grandfathers. And so I think this is something that is certainly relevant to people in subsequent generations. I'm just hoping that there will be a lot of interest, and that before everything is lost, within families as well as in, at least the archives will have the information. But if the families don't donate the documents and the artifacts, this will all be lost.
Yeah, I think one of the most, not necessarily shocking, but discouraging, frustrating things I realized in reading your book, and especially as you talk about how your grandfather in many ways was comparatively assimilated. And so it's likely that if he had been able to become a United States citizen, he would have. And yet, so he was arrested because he wasn't a citizen, but he was precluded by law from becoming a citizen because of his Japanese identity. So it was a real catch-22 for all of these people.
It was. And that's why I thought that petition that I discussed briefly was so interesting, because they were claiming citizenship despite the fact that they have been excluded from citizenship. Just by using the petition form.
Right.
But their argument was based on their being good citizens.
Right.
And it's very, very fascinating. And I discuss it in some detail in the book, how they made that argument.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because they didn't, and this is always an interesting point, they didn't follow protocol. They were supposed to write individual petitions, not a group petition, but they wrote a group petition, and therefore the government could say, this doesn't follow protocol. And so it was basically ignored.
Yeah.
But my feeling is, and I make this point in the book, that those of us who are descendants, and those of us, whether we're descendants of those men or just descendants, of that period, these signatures become very symbolic, for me anyway, because it shows the effort. I mean, these are all signatures of individual men. And they show that they were asserting themselves, despite they didn't know that this was not following protocol. They were just signing their names to a petition because they believed in what they were asking for. And they basically were asking to be returned to Hawaii because they were so isolated for 4 years from their families, and they just wanted to go home.
Right.
They were willing to continue incarceration in Hawaii, as they said, but they wanted to be closer to their families. And so their signatures represent, to me, are symbolic of their will.
Yes.
And their assertion and their dissent, in a sense. You know,
Right.
this is where my cut comes from.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I appreciate all that you've shared with us, and thank you to everyone who's joined in the virtual world. As I said, we have recorded this and it will be posted on YouTube. If you search for Let's Talk Books at NMU by midweek next week, you'll be able to find it. And if you forget how to do that, just email me at english@nmu.edu and I will certainly respond. So thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for coming.